This happened about 5 years ago when I was 9 months pregnant. It was a Saturday night, and I was Christmas shopping at the mall with my two daughters. One was 7, and the other was 15. We live in a super safe city with a low crime rate, so I didn't think twice about being out late. There was an Applebee's connected to the mall, and since we were finishing our shopping close to closing time, I decided to take the girls there for a late dinner. By the time we were done, it was around 10 p.m., and we walked out through the Applebee's entrance into a nearly deserted parking lot, loaded down with shopping bags. As we got to the car, I was fumbling with the bags on my arms, trying to dig out my car keys, when I noticed a man, probably in his 50s, walking toward us from somewhere in the parking lot. He had shaggy gray and white hair, a faded flannel shirt, and worn-out jeans. At first, I didn't think much of it, but then he got closer, maybe 40 feet away, and suddenly said, "This is a stick-up. Give me all your money." I froze. My blood ran cold, and I stared at him in disbelief. What?" I stammered, my voice shaking. Then, as casually as you can imagine, he said, "Just kidding." But he didn't stop there. He came right up to my car and stood next to my daughters, who were waiting on the other side of the car for me to unlock the doors. At this point, I'm trying to stay calm, but my brain is screaming, "This is not okay." He starts making small talk with me and my kids, asking questions like whether they were being good for Santa, how old they were, if we got all our Christmas shopping done, and what we'd bought. He seemed totally coherent, not drunk, high, or mentally unstable, just a perfectly sound and creepy adult. Now picture this. I'm a very pregnant woman, alone in a mostly empty parking lot at 10 p.m., with 2 kids and shopping bags, and this random guy is casually chatting us up. He's standing right next to my kids, and I'm on the opposite side of the car, trying to act calm while frantically digging in my purse for my car keys. He's talking away, and I'm trying to politely keep the situation from escalating. My hands are shaking as I search for my keys in what feels like a bottomless pit of a purse. Meanwhile, he keeps glancing over his shoulder, which only adds to my unease. I'm doing my best to stay composed, but inside, I'm panicking. I had this gut feeling that at any moment, he could pull out a weapon, and my kids were right there, separated from me. My older daughter, the 15-year-old, was clearly getting uncomfortable. She kept glancing at me, trying to gauge my reaction. Kids tend to assume everything's fine if their parents seem calm, and since he was just talking, and I wasn't freaking out, on the outside at least, they didn't pick up on how dangerous this situation felt. I was 9 months pregnant, and no match for a grown man, especially if he was hiding a weapon. I tried everything to subtly end the conversation. I smiled politely and said things like, "It was nice chatting, but we've got to get going. Time to get the kids to bed." I even prompted my daughters to say goodbye, but he wasn't taking the hint. He kept sidestepping my attempts to wrap things up, asking the girls questions about their favorite school subjects and telling them what lovely young ladies they were. Meanwhile, my 7-year-old, who is naturally outgoing, was completely oblivious to how not okay this situation was. To her, he was just a friendly stranger, and she had that innocent, "I'm with mommy, so I'm safe" mindset. So, what does she do? She starts chatting away, telling him about the Christmas gift she picked out for her dad, and asking if he knew what Minecraft was. At this point, I'm dying inside. Her enthusiastic chatter is only encouraging him to stick around, and I can't find my keys fast enough to get us out of there. At some point, this sinking feeling of dread hit me like a ton of bricks. What if I lost my keys in the mall? The thought made my stomach drop. Here I was, standing outside with my 2 kids. A strange man who kept glancing over his shoulder, and no way to get into the car. He wasn't leaving. He was just standing there, talking, as if he were waiting for something. And then it hit me. What if he's waiting for the perfect moment to act? The horrifying scenarios started flooding my mind. What if he grabbed one of my girls and used them as leverage? If he threatened their lives, I'd do anything he said, no question. My heart started racing, my stomach doing those nauseating flip-flops, and my adrenaline kicked into overdrive. I felt like any second now, this was going to go south. We were completely alone. No witnesses, no one around to help. In that moment, it felt like all the odds were against us. And then, out of nowhere, he said, "Okay, it was nice talking with you. See you later." Just like that. He casually turned and walked off in the same direction he came from. As soon as he left, my hands finally landed on my car keys, buried in my purse. I unlocked the car, my voice shaking as I told my kids, "Get in, fast." They climbed in, and I jumped in right after, locking the doors as soon as they closed. My hands were trembling as I started the car and sped out of there like my life depended on it. My 15-year-old, in that classic teenager way, broke the tension by laughing and saying, "Well, that was weird." She brushed it off, joking like it was no big deal. I was flooded with relief, but at the same time, I was so confused. I kept thinking, what the hell just happened? Why would a seemingly normal guy think it was okay to approach a woman and her kids in an empty parking lot at night just to chat? It was bizarre, but since nothing bad had actually happened, I let myself laugh about it too. When we got home, my husband greeted us, asking how shopping went. I said it was fine, but my 15-year-old told him the parking lot story, laughing about how strange it was. I joined in, joking about how I was having a full-blown panic attack while trying to act calm and dig through my purse like nothing was wrong. But then I noticed my husband's face. He went completely pale. His horrified expression stopped me in my tracks, and I quickly tried to reassure him. Look, it was creepy, sure, but the guy was just talking. He eventually left on his own. I didn't think it was a big deal anymore. That's when my husband explained, and what he said shook me to my core. He told me, in no uncertain terms, that the man was likely waiting for me to unlock the car. That's why he stayed so close to us, especially next to the kids. My husband set his position, right by the backseat passenger door, where my 7-year-old was standing. Wasn't a coincidence. His plan was probably to force his way into the car as soon as the doors unlocked. Once inside, he could have pulled a weapon on the kids, knowing I wouldn't abandon them. He'd have leverage to make me cooperate, likely forcing me to drive somewhere remote. And worse. And then my husband dropped another bomb. The fact that the man wasn't wearing a mask. That, he explained, strongly suggested he didn't plan to leave any witnesses. The reality of what could have happened started to sink in, and I felt sick. Then I remembered how long it had taken me to find my keys. My husband said that delay probably spooked the guy. The longer I rummaged in my purse, the more time passed, and the less confident he became. That delay, something that had me panicking in the moment, may have been the reason he decided to walk away. It was like some kind of divine intervention that my keys stayed hidden just long enough to save us. I still get chills thinking about how close we came to a situation that could have ended very, very differently. This rather embarrassing story takes me back to when I was about 19 years old. I'm a guy from Australia, and this happened in the mid-2000s. It was Boxing Day, the day after Christmas for those who might not know, and the local shopping center was buzzing with people chasing the big sales. My wallet was packed with cash, so I hopped in my car and headed to the mall, ready to snag some bargains. But of course, everyone else in town had the same idea. The parking lot was a complete madhouse. Cars were barely moving, and everyone seemed to be circling endlessly looking for a spot. While I was crawling along in the line of traffic, I noticed a man off to my left. He was middle-aged, a little overweight, and oddly dressed for the middle of summer. He was waving in my direction. I ignored him and kept driving, figuring he was someone else's problem. A few minutes later, I looped back around, still no closer to finding a park. And there he was, still standing in the same spot. This time, traffic ahead of me had stopped completely, so I had nowhere to go. That's when he walked over to the passenger side window. Now let me tell you, this guy did not give me a good vibe. He had a shaved head, random tattoos, an unkempt fake leather jacket, and for some reason, gloves. Gloves in the sweltering Australian summer heat. Looking back, I have no idea why I made the decision I did, but, well, here's what happened. "Hey, mate," he said, leaning towards my window. "Merry Christmas. Reckon you could do me a favor and drive me to Cash Converters?" For context, Cash Converters is a pawn shop, quick loan place, just a couple of streets over from the mall. Now maybe it was the Christmas spirit still lingering in the air, or maybe I thought I could handle myself if anything weird happened. Or honestly, maybe I was just fed up with the parking chaos and welcomed the distraction. Either way, I leaned over, unlocked the door, and said, "Why not?" He climbed in. As we drove off, he started talking. "I just liquidated my business," he said. Apparently, he'd owned an electronics shop. I wasn't buying it, though. His sketchy appearance didn't exactly scream successful businessman. In hindsight, my gut was already telling me this was a mistake. Then he said, "I can sell you a cheap laptop or a DVD player. Gotta get rid of everything. That's why I need to go to Cashies." I tried to play it cool. "Nah, cheers though," I said, as casually as I could. Meanwhile, I noticed something that made me even more uneasy. He hadn't put on his seatbelt. "Come on," he urged. "It'll be brand new. Here's the place." He motioned to a spot ahead, and I reluctantly pulled over near an Asian grocer. The area didn't look like much. Definitely not a place where you'd expect to shop. Still, I stopped the car. "My old shop's behind the grocer," he said. "Hang on, I'll get you something nice." This was the moment I decided I'd had enough. "No," I said firmly, "and I think I'll leave you here." His tone shifted. "What are you saying?" he asked, and I could feel the tension rising. "I'd like you to get out of the car, thanks," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. His demeanor shifted instantly. "Are you threatening me?" he asked, turning his whole body to face me. "No," I replied, suddenly hyper-aware that I was still buckled in. Before I could unclip, he added, "I carry a knife for when cunts like you try to threaten me." That's when my mouth went completely dry. He reached into his pocket, and my heart started pounding. I raised both hands, trying to look as non-threatening as possible. "I'm not threatening you," I said, keeping my voice calm despite the panic rising in my chest. Then he pulled out a knife. It wasn't some fancy switchblade or anything. It was just a regular kitchen knife, but it was big enough to make my blood run cold. "How about you give me whatever cash you've got in your wallet," he said, "and I'll bring you back a laptop like I promised." I realized I had no choice. "You're robbing me," I said quietly, my hands shaking as I reached for my wallet. I had to lift my hips off the seat to fish it out of my back pocket, and all I could think was how easy it would be for him to stab me right then and there. If he wanted to, he could take the car too. "Not robbing you," he insisted, as if that made any difference. He leaned over and plucked the yellow $50 bills straight out of my wallet, pinching them like he was handling dirty laundry. "You'll have a Dell in 2 minutes," he added, tucking the money away. He slipped the knife back into his pocket, opened the car door, and casually strolled into the grocer's shop. As soon as he was out, I locked the doors and grabbed my phone. My hands were still shaking as I dialed 000, the emergency number here in Australia, and explained what had just happened. The operator assured me that the police were nearby, given that the station was just a street over, and they'd be there soon. "I'm going into the shop," I told them. Honestly, I can't remember if they thought that was a good idea or not. I was too rattled to care. I stepped into the grocer and asked the staff if they'd seen a guy matching his description. They just shook their heads and acted like they didn't understand me. I figured he'd slipped out the back and was long gone. Long story short, he got away. The police showed up about 10 minutes later, and while they were professional, they couldn't help but point out how stupid I'd been to let such a sketchy guy into my car. I gave them my statement back at the station, and that was pretty much the end of it. I'd lost a few $100s for trying to be a well-meaning, but clearly foolish, Samaritan. A couple of weeks later, I got a call from the constable who'd taken my statement. Apparently, some girls had been robbed in the same mall by someone matching the guy's description. He'd sat down at their table in the food court and told them he had a knife under the table, then demanded their money. The constable said they'd call me if they needed me to view footage or come in for anything, but I never heard from them again. The whole ordeal haunted me for a while. I usually pride myself on having pretty good instincts, but that day, I felt like I'd completely failed myself. I didn't even tell anyone about it for a couple of weeks. I was too embarrassed about being such an easy mark. What stuck with me most, though, was the way this guy operated. Somehow, he managed to frame his actions as if I were the threat, and he was doing me a favor by robbing me. I couldn't decide if that bizarre psychological approach was something he actually believed, or if it was just a tactic to keep me off balance. One thing was certain. Even with the Christmas spirit in full swing, I learned to be a lot more careful about who I offered to help after that. For a bit of background, I'm a 22-year-old guy living in a big city in the Midwest. I drive for Lyft to help pay my way through trade school. I also work with a few other similar companies, but that's not important right now. Let's just say I've had my fair share of horror stories while driving, but those will have to wait for another day. This particular incident happened on Christmas Eve in 2020. I was out driving for a few hours before heading to my mom's house to celebrate with my wife and our newborn. It was a pretty standard night, nothing unusual. I got a ride request from a lower-income apartment complex. Nothing out of the ordinary there. When I arrived, I found my passenger right away. He was standing there with all of his belongings, several boxes of stuff. Now, my car is a 2006 Chevy Impala, so space was definitely tight, but we managed to squeeze everything in. Barely. Once we were on our way, He started crying. Through his tears, he explained that he'd just caught his girlfriend cheating on him earlier that night. To make things worse, the apartment was in her name, so he couldn't stay there anymore. He didn't have anywhere else to go, so I was taking him to a motel. Now let me tell you about this motel. It was on a street in my city, infamous for all kinds of shady activity. Hookers, drugs, gangs, weapons, and the sketchiest motels you can imagine. You name it, it's happening on this street. When we arrived, he asked me to wait for him while he went inside to check in and get his room key. "No problem, man," I said. Now, here's where I have a bit of a confession to make. I bend the rules a little when it comes to driving for Lyft. You see, I keep a gun in a concealed holster secured under the driver's seat. I've had it there ever since I started driving because, well, I've had my fair share of close calls. I've had knives pulled on me, people try to rob me, fight me, you name it. It's not something I'd recommend, but it's my way of feeling a little safer out there. Back to the story. This motel was every bit as sketchy as you'd expect for a place on that street. Homeless people were wandering around everywhere. Over in the far corner of the complex, I saw a guy slumped against the wall with a needle still in his arm. The whole vibe of the place was like something straight out of a true crime podcast or a horror story. The guy got his key, and since the motel was all ground level, I offered to drive him to his door to make unloading all his stuff easier. As I mentioned earlier, my passenger had a lot of stuff, so I decided to help him unload. On my second trip back to the car to grab more boxes, something caught my eye. A guy walked out of a room just a bit south of where my car was parked. Two women followed close behind him. At first, I didn't think much of it, but then they made their way over to the room right next to the one my passenger was moving into. One of the women pounded on the door before opening it. That's when things took a terrifying turn. I saw the guy pull a shotgun out from under his long coat and storm into the room. The two women followed him, slamming the door behind them. I froze. My heart started racing as I heard yelling and shouting coming from inside. I was bracing myself, just waiting for the sound of gunfire. Out of nowhere, my passenger came up behind me. "I can take it from here, man," he said calmly. "Go ahead and take off. Have a Merry Christmas." Before I could even process what was happening, he grabbed the boxes out of my hands and slipped a cash tip, a crumpled $5 bill, into my pocket. I didn't even register it at first because I was completely frozen. My mind was spinning, replaying what I'd just seen. I knew what might be going down in that room, and I knew the guy with the shotgun, along with both women, had seen me. Worse, I knew they knew I'd seen the gun. One thought kept running through my head. I have to leave. Now. I bolted back to my car, jumped in, and sped away as fast as I could. My hands were shaking so badly, I could barely grip the steering wheel. I drove a block or so before pulling over and calling the cops. I gave them every detail I could remember. What the guy looked like, the two women, the room they went into, everything. After hanging up with the police, I logged out of the Lyft app. I hadn't made much money that night, but I didn't care. I was done. Later that night, I got a call from the cops. They told me they'd investigated, but hadn't found the gunman or the two women. The people in the room they'd gone into claimed nothing had happened, and even suggested I'd made the whole thing up. The cops didn't find any evidence to back up my story. But I know what I saw. A shotgun doesn't just magically appear in someone's coat and then vanish into thin air. That whole night still sends chills down my spine.